Everybody, this is the February 4th, 2019 meeting of the Portland Children's Levy. Thank you all for being here. This is the first allocation committee meeting of 2019. I'm Ted Wheeler, of course. I am the mayor of the city of Portland, and I'm thrilled to be here today. I'd like to also thank my predecessor, retired Portland City Commissioner Dan Saltzman, for really being the brainchild behind this effort and bringing it forward and making sure that children in our community are a priority. I also want to acknowledge the service of Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafori. She's been serving on this committee for a number of years, and she served on the committee, as I understand it, through October, if I have that correctly. I feel very fortunate to be helping to oversee a program that's universally seen as being both well-run and highly efficient with taxpayer funds, while at the same time providing very important and critical services to thousands of children and families so they can overcome historical and institutional barriers and flourish in our community. I am absolutely looking forward to my new role in this capacity, and I want to remind folks that what goes around comes around. This is actually my second stint serving on this board. I served here as well as the former chair of Multnomah County. I also want to start by welcoming my colleagues, Julie Young. She is the city-appointed member and has served for quite some time. Felicia Tripp-Folsom, who will, is she coming? She'll be here, and she's the county-based appointed member. Mitch Horniker, who's our business community representative. And of course, we have another new face here alongside me. I'm delighted to welcome Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson. And she's right here, in case you're wondering where she is. You can applaud, that's okay. She's new, she's great. I have long known and admired her work in the community, especially around equity issues and her diligent efforts to expand access to early childhood education. And she, of course, chairs the county's Preschool for All task force. And we now also have Felicia is with us here. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yes.
So welcome all. We also have our amazing Portland Children's Levy staff here throughout the room, but they seem to be mostly congregating over here. Lisa Pellegrino, Meg McElroy, Lisa Hansel, Mary Gay Broderick, John Kelly, and John Coughlin. So before we get started, let's approve the minutes of the October 22nd meeting. Do I call the roll on this? It's been so long. It's okay, very good. All in favor? Well, do I need a motion? In a second? Okay, I'll need a motion in a second, please.
So moved.
Second.
So we have a motion from Vega-Peterson and a second from Horniker. Any further discussion? Call the roll. I call the roll. Let's take a vote. Who's in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Who's opposed? We did it. That is our first business item for 2019. The box is now checked. Next, we have time for public comment. I want to be very clear, the public comment at this point is for any item that is not specifically on our agenda. Is there anybody here who wants to testify on items not on our agenda? Going once? Oh, why can't Wednesdays be like this? All right, moving on. We'll kick off the meeting with a presentation from Portland State University and the Levy staff on the grant-making process improvement recommendations. Meg's going to tee us up with some background, and then she'll return after PSU's presentation to discuss how the staff would like us to proceed in considering the recommendations during the next 5 months. I also want to be very clear, there will be no vote on this subject today, and we will open up the floor for public comment after the discussion. Are those all for you?
Yeah.
Excellent.
I'm going to have a really dry mouth in this meeting. I'll be talking a lot. So this is for our guests from Portland State University. So I just want to remind for the folks who are not who have not been following this process closely and are here with us in the room or viewing at home, and for our allocation committee, as it's been a while since we've talked about this. Last summer, the allocation committee at that time voted to issue an intermediate request for proposals through the City Bureau of Procurement to hire a consultant to design and implement a qualitative research project that really looked at the Portland Children's Levy grant-making process from the point of view of applicants, those who had received funding and those who hadn't, from the point of view of allocation committee members, and from the point of view of other local stakeholders, including other local funders. That RFP process resulted in a contract between the Portland Children's Levy and Portland State University's Center for Improvement of Child and Family Services. The research team is led by Tuan Dong, who's a research associate at the center, and Dr. Alma Trinidad, who is an associate professor in the School of Social Work. So I would like to invite them and their team up and ask them to introduce themselves before they get started on walking you through their presentation on the report that was issued to you for this meeting, and it was also sent to our Levy contacts distribution list, so over 2,000 folks in the public, and through our social media channels.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. One of the first things we did as a team was review and analyze these meetings. And so I'm having sort of a meta experience of what it would be like to analyze ourselves right now.
Those little green lights indicate that your microphone is live.
Oh, okay. Shall we upload? If it's okay, we'll just jump right into the presentation.
Is there anybody here under 15 years age? We need you right now. There it is, I think.
So I wanted to start off by saying when we're dealing with the amount of data we dealt with and in the time frame that we had, it can be easy to miss the forest for the trees. And I want to start out by acknowledging that we've missed if not the forest, a really big tree in our report, and it was not highlighting an important finding in our work, we spoke with 66 individuals, not including Children's Levy staff, and what we learned is that the Portland Children's Levy community, which includes applicants, both funded and unfunded, staff, allocation committee members, and other local funders, are all doing really great work, and they're doing it with integrity. It's always easy to come in and point out where there are changes that need to be made, but I want to start out by pointing out that this work is so important and that everyone we spoke to is committed to improving the lives of children and youth in our community, and that they should all be really proud of their work. Today's presentation will begin with a quick review of our research design, including our approach, methods, data sources, and analyses. And then Kevin, at the end, will walk you through our findings. And then Leash and I will talk about our priority recommendations. And then we'll be happy to take questions at the end. Or we can do is
using that.
Okay. Our approach is an institutional analysis. An institutional analysis is a type of review. Can people see this, or should I stop? Okay.
Maybe this is.
Just keep going. We're going to do it.
Okay. An institutional analysis is a type of a review of a system. A hallmark of an institutional analysis, or an IA, is that it considers the system as an actor. So it really looks at the processes involved in create a system. So policies, laws and ordinances, procedures, even workflow processes that make up a system. So our goal was to evaluate the system. It's also where we wanted to focus our recommendations, in part because systemic recommendations changes is where sustainable changes occur. And an institutional analysis also assumes bias or inequities in all systems. And we want to acknowledge this right off the bat, that we're looking for bias and inequities. And of course, we're going to find them. We want to emphasize that they exist in all systems and that all systems should acknowledge this so that we move forward on the work of making programs and systems and institutions more just. And an IA is values-based. And our value-based, we focus on equity and particularly racial equity in our analysis. And institutional analysis sort of guides our approach, our framing, our questions, our design, but they don't prescribe our methods. And our methods are qualitative. That was part of the parameters of our work, was that we were to create a qualitative project. And our methods are grounded in the 2014 grant-making process. So that was going to be where we looked. We would look at 2014 grantees and applicants. We would review proposals from 2014. We would review the allocation meetings from 2014. We also conducted 2 literature reviews. The literature reviews, oh, there we are. The literature reviews looked at best practices in participatory grant making and also equitable practices in grant making. Unfortunately, most of the literature out there is focused on private foundations, so we had to do some sort of translation to make it make sense for the public funding. We also did interviews and focus groups. We interviewed applicants who were both funded and unfunded in 2014. We interviewed PCL staff. We interviewed members of the allocation committee. And we also interviewed members of the local funding community. Our organizing framework is this pre-proposal. Oh, wait, I have slides here. It's the pre-proposal process, the proposal process, the review and recommendation process, and the decision and allocation process. It's just a way for us to divide the grant-making process so that we could talk about it and ask about it and analyze around it. Kevin will tell you a lot more about that in a few minutes. I want to talk a little bit about our data sources, the amount of data we're talking about here. The N in this slide refers to the number of agencies interviewed or represented. Does not include the number of people, because many agencies sent more than one person. So we organized this slide by not new, meaning prior to 2014 they were funded. And in 2014 they were funded or unfunded organizations. 21 of them were a part of our review. We also talked about culturally specific agencies who were both funded and unfunded in 2014, and that was 5 different agencies. There were 6 agencies that were new to the Children's Levy in 2014 and that were funded, and 4 that were new and not funded, who we talked to. And we also talked to 6 different individuals who represented different entities, including foundations in the local area and allocation committee members. And this is my favorite slide, because what it is just a bunch of puzzle pieces. And that is sort of what our mid-December looked like. We had a bunch of puzzle pieces together. And what those puzzle pieces sort of represent is 66 different interviews that are transcribed, 2 different literature reviews, RFI documents, hundreds and hundreds of pages of proposals that we reviewed, and some the reviewer materials. And so our job is to sort of make sense of this and sort of implications for this grant-making process. And how we do that is we sort of get to confidence in our findings. And the sort of hallmarks that we're looking for when we're doing qualitative research is saturation. And saturation means that we're hearing the same 2, 3, 4 stories over and over again, we have captured sort of the breadth of it. We're also looking for complexity. Complexity is when those stories have different variations. So it's not like everyone's telling the same story, because that means we're not asking the right questions. So we're looking for complexity. We're also looking for subtlety, which is related to complexity, but it focuses on our understanding, the research understanding of the relationship between the stories and how they're similar or different. For instance, they might tell the same story, but a funded applicant and an unfunded applicant have different variations, and we need to be able to understand those variations and why, and try to locate it into possibly because they're funded or unfunded. And we're also looking for resonance, that what we are finding out, it sort of resonates with the literature reviews we've done, sort of resonates with people we've spoken to, resonates with Children's Levy staff and our conversations with them. And finally, we're also looking at validity. And validity is really, like, we thought about it in relationship to our recommendations, that they're applicable, that they make sense given our findings, and that they are, that they attend to our purpose, right? So we're not saying, there is no sort of recommendation for everyone to go to Disneyland, right? So validity is what we're paying attention to as well. And we feel like we really did have a lot of confidence in our findings. And we start to put our puzzle piece together. And then findings. Again, Kevin will go much more in depth into findings, but we really start to see that findings start to separate to two primary categories: increasing transparency and strengthening equitable practices. There are ruptures that occurred that create a lack of confidence in the grant-making process or the perception of fairness in the process, and we think increasing transparency will help to mitigate that lack of confidence. Through our conversations with the Children's Levy staff and review of proposals and other materials, we saw that there were many times when these processes were being conducted with integrity, but that they weren't being communicated so that applicants were interviewed, that we interviewed, recognized this, or they weren't being communicated enough. Sometimes people need to hear things more than once or at the right time. And then there are also places where there are just more opportunities for transparency and to increase equity. Also, many of the strengths that we identify are also related to these two categories, that where their transparency is really offered and where there are equitable practices in place.
All right, that's me. Thanks, Tuan. I see a placard that says, please state your name for the record, so I will do that. My name is Kevin Cherry, and I'm a PhD student and instructor at the School of Social Work at Portland State University. So I will be going through these 4 different phases of the grant-making process that Tuan introduced. I will provide an overview of findings for each phase, specifically highlighting the major strengths and challenges in each phase. And of course, these strengths and challenges that we highlight are what lay the groundwork for the recommendations for improvement that we provide. Of course, the strengths and challenges that I'll be highlighting are discussed in more detail in our final report, which we would encourage everyone in attendance to read. So, the pre-proposal process. We conceptualize the pre-proposal phase as everything that occurs in preparation for submitting a proposal. And during the focus groups and interviews, we primarily asked about the bidders conference. Strengths of the pre-proposal phase. Almost universally, participants find the bidders conference to be an effective way for PCL to share their funding priorities and to provide information about the mechanics of the proposal and how to go about completing it. Another strength here is that participants highlight the importance of engaging with PCL staff in the bidders conference. They see this as an opportunity to begin relationship building with staff, and we're overwhelmingly appreciative of how engaging and responsive staff were at this stage in the process. And this relationship building is especially important for agencies who are newer to PCL for reasons that I'll turn to now. 2 primary challenges emerged during the pre-proposal phase. The first of those challenges is related to this previous point about the importance of relationship building. And the challenge here is that many organizations, especially previous PCL grantees, already have relationships with PCL. And along with these established relationships comes previous knowledge and previous experience about all things PCL related, including the grant-making process, of course. And we refer to this phenomenon in our report as accumulated knowledge and accumulated cultural capital. Now, of course, these aren't necessarily bad things, but they can lead to perceptions of a high barrier of entry for newer applicants. One participant stated, as a matter of fact, quote, "We know these organizations are going to continue to be funded." So ultimately, this highlights the importance of information sharing and relationship building for newer applicants at this point in the process. Second challenge, related challenge, is feelings of uncertainty and anxiety about subsequent phases of the grant-making process, and especially how final allocation decisions are made. And I will highlight some of the specific challenges emerging with these subsequent phases in the coming slides. So the second phase that we looked at is the proposal phase. And this phase focuses on agencies' experiences developing and submitting an application in response to a PCL RFI. There are two major strengths in this proposal phase to highlight. The first strength is that applicants find the RFI to be clear, well-organized, and thorough, which leads to conclusions that the RFI ultimately rewards good programming. Here's what one participant stated about this topic. Quote, "I think the application process really rewards well-thought-out programs. I think it really rewards organizations that are credible stakeholders within the community, who speak for the community, but have solvency and strength. I would say a positive is that the application process is a very good steward of public funds." As a result of the RFI being clear and well-organized, applicants find the process of completing a proposal relatively straightforward. And importantly, when they do have questions about completing a proposal, they receive adequate support and timely support from PCL staff. The main challenge in the proposal phase can be thought of as a byproduct of the RFI's thoroughness. And specifically, completing the RFI requires a high level of detail and organizational sophistication that further solidifies a high barrier to entry, which ends up rewarding and prioritizing a certain type of applicant organization. We repeatedly heard from applicants that the level of data required for a proposal, in addition to the human resources and internal organizational capacity, can be an overwhelming barrier for applicants. Third phase that we looked at is the review and recommendation phase. And this focuses on all activities that occur after the submission of an application and before the allocation committee's final funding decisions. And for PCL, this primarily entails community-based reviewers scoring applications and then PCL staff formulating their funding recommendations. The first strength to note is about the community review and scoring process. After interviewing PCL staff, it became clear that there is an explicit effort to value diversity in the community reviewers, both diversity of lived experience and diversity of content knowledge, including knowledge specific to culturally responsive and culturally specific work. PCL's efforts to recruit reviewers in this manner are supported by applicants' desires to have their proposals reviewed by individuals with a wide range of expertise and knowledge, including knowledge about the local service context. The second strength is about the PCL staff recommendations, and specifically there is a recognition that PCL staff have a depth of knowledge about applicants and the broader service landscape in Portland that community reviewers may not always have. For this reason, PCL staff recommendations are perceived as credible, even by those who were not recommended for funding. Several challenges are unique to this phase of the grant-making process. One challenge is perceived inequities in the community reviews and PCL recommendations. And these inequities emerge from two primary sources. The first source is the possibilities of bias as a result of personal opinions or conflicts of interest. The second source is the possibility that reviewers or PCL staff are basing decisions on insufficient information. Participants in our interviews and focus group raised questions like, quote, "Are there people on the review committee who understand the complexities of working with our community?" Or, quote, "Can someone who doesn't have expertise in mentoring really review a mentoring application?" Another important challenge to highlight begins in this review and recommendation phase and reaches a crescendo in the allocation phase. And this challenge is that it is not clear to applicants what the relationship is between community reviewer scores, staff recommendations, and the final allocation decisions. And I'll speak to this challenge a bit more in the next slide. The final challenge in this phase is about the culturally specific bonus points. First, applicants questioned whether the amount of culturally specific bonus points sufficiently prioritizes issues of racial equity. In addition, after interviewing PCL staff and reviewing the 2014 RFI and the 2014 funding decisions, we detected a lack of clarity about the scoring guidelines for culturally specific bonus points. This resulted in one of our major recommendations that Tuan will discuss a little bit further, wherein we propose revisions to the RFI on the sections that deal with cultural responsiveness and cultural specificity and the culturally specific bonus points. Final phase is the allocation, the funding decision phase. This refers, of course, to the Public Allocation Committee hearings, where PCL staff present their funding recommendations, where applicant agencies testify and also have a period of time to engage in private advocacy of the allocation committee for their applications, and wherein the committee arrives at final funding decisions. And I hate to break it to you, but in general, this phase of the grant-making process is overwhelmingly disliked by nearly all stakeholders. I'll discuss some of those reasons in a moment. But there are a few important strengths of this phase to highlight. First, this phase allows applicants to put a face with their name for the allocation committee, to share their work, to share their programs with the individuals who will ultimately be making final funding decisions. This is especially important because up until this point, applicants have been interacting and building relationships with PCL staff, but not the final decision makers. Second strength emerges from the very nature of the allocation committee, and specifically that the committee's decisions have to be made in public. This requirement of public decision-making enforces a level of transparency that is valued, but that also can be further bolstered. And we do provide multiple recommendations for increasing transparency in this phase. So again, one of the major challenges is widespread dissatisfaction with this phase of the process. Applicants generally dislike the public testimony and the in-the-moment decision-making. It is too high-pressured for applicants. This phase can feel intimidating and shaming, and it is highly uncomfortable for applicants to be sitting in the same room competing with their peers. One participant said, "The testimony in front of all the other grantees in the chambers with the allocation committee up there and all your peers behind feels to me like you're in court or like you're trying to sell yourself. And I love all the programs. I care about the work that my colleagues are doing. And yet I feel like you are in the Coliseum. And if you don't have meat for the lion, you are not going to survive." I get that it's a competitive process, but that feels too competitive emotionally. I think it is hard to be articulate. I think it incites performance anxiety in trying to be clever and articulate. The process is too dependent on the person's ego strength, their personality, their ability to tolerate anxiety, and how competitive they are. To me, that is not what we should be rewarding. A second similar challenge is about equity as it relates to the public testimony and private advocacy. As the previous quote demonstrates, a 2-minute public testimony is high-pressured and anxiety-inducing. And at the same time, applicants perceive the testimony to be a critical opportunity that they should take advantage of. Applicants also perceive private advocacy of allocation committee members as a critical opportunity to bolster their applications. It is important to note here, though, that not all applicants were aware they could engage in private advocacy of the allocation committee. So despite testimony and advocacy being seen as critical opportunities that applicants should take advantage of, our participants highlighted that it's easier for some applicants than others to really take advantage of these opportunities and benefit from them. I'll paraphrase one participant who effectively captured this concern. It is inequitable around things like if there are applicants who are really politically savvy, they strategize about how to get meetings with allocation committee members where they get to answer any questions the committee members might have. Then they go into the allocation committee with a halo, and the allocation committee members see this bright, shining light. This is different than organizations without this political savvy, where you sit at the allocation table with a client and you have your 2 minutes, and the client speaks another language, so half of your testimony is actually translation. And by that point in the meeting, the allocation committee is on the third funding category, they're tired, and they just say, yep, that's good, and then it's over. The last challenge in this phase is about how the final allocation decisions are made. In some instances, applicants perceived these final decisions to be both unpredictable and unrelated to the previous phases of the grant-making process, including the community reviews, staff recommendations, and public testimony. One person pointedly asked, quote, "Is their decision made before they walk through the door and this is all for show?" Several applicants described a sense of unpredictability and a lack of confidence in the final funding decision, and they described what they would like to see instead. Quote, "Yeah, in theory, it seems ludicrous to me. In theory, the allocation committee should be held. If an organization did a great job on an application and has a great staff recommendation, I think that should be a clear indication as to how an allocation should come. So yeah, there should be parameters or a clear connection as to, okay, if you're scored here and if you're recommended, you go here. It's like a flow chart." Another participant said, quote, "I think for me, I would rather see more decision-making stay with the staff and to have the allocation committee's role more prescribed. I just don't think it is practical for them to gain the same knowledge as staff. It's similar to any elected official. They have professional staffers whose job it is to be the expert in some really narrow aspect of X, Y, or Z. It is technical knowledge that you need to have. I would parallel it to that. They are not, as the elected representative, they don't know everything about everything. It is not practical, but they have people they trust, and then they develop their positions based on those people's work." So that concludes sort of our dive into the major strengths and challenges that emerge from each phase of the grant-making process. And as I mentioned previously, it is precisely these strengths and challenges that provide the basis for our recommendations for improving the process. And Tuan and Leisha are now going to go into further depth about what these recommendations are.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
And I don't know what my colleagues usually do. Do we ask questions as we go, or do we hold them off till the end? What's the preference? Well, I'd prefer we just ask when we have them. That way I won't forget. So this is actually very compelling, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate the frankness of the people who responded to your survey or your interviews or however you chose to do it. But I did have a question. This perceived disparities in who can fully access and benefit from advocacy, can you confirm that that in fact happens? Is this based on a reality? Do people meet individually with the allocation committee members, and then the allocation committee members come here and they advocate for an organization that they met with?
I don't know if I'm understanding the question correctly, but does private advocacy occur? Yes, according to both policy, but also according to our data.
Interesting.
That people can, particularly because I think and Meg might correct me, is I think because several of you on the committee are public officials, your constituents have to have access to you. So I think in order to make it a fairer process, they created this, that any grantee or applicant could reach out and do private advocacy.
Well, that's interesting because we actually don't do that. when we have an RFP out in the field, we do not meet with the people who are submitting to the RFP for this very reason. So I guess my question is there a policy, or how do people typically react to this?
Can I chime in?
yeah,
Just
go
as a
ahead.
staff, a point of staff clarification. Because the allocation committee operates a grant-making procedure, it is not dictated by the RFP typical structures that procurement works under. It's a grant application, and so those requests for investment documents are structured much differently than how procurement does an RFP process. And each of your individual emails and the previous email addresses of the previous allocation committee members are available on the Levy website, and how an applicant chooses to contact any particular member of the committee and how that committee committee member chooses to respond to that applicant is in the hands of the committee member.
Well, that's
and they have not
interesting.
typically consulted staff on those issues.
Okay, interesting. I look forward to your recommendation on that point.
I'd like to.
I will just say for the record, I don't have time. I do not have time to meet with everybody who would like to have the opportunity to speak with me about an allocation. So I will probably just develop my own policy.
And this is where some of the inequities show up, though, because some people have prior relationships, right? This is what we're talking about.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in, I
Sure.
also know that probably for a lot of those folks who are going for a grant, we may have other business that we need to meet on while they're going through the grant process, you know, as in terms of just regular county business. So it does get murky in terms of how you manage those meetings and relationships.
I'd like to add, I'm Dr. Alma Trinidad, one of the co-principal investigator, and I just want to emphasize that these are our findings and the perceptions of our participants, that this is a perception that is happening or ruminating among the participants that we interviewed.
Okay, well, but I asked the question about, is this a perception or is this actually factually happening? And if I understood your answer correctly, you're saying this is factually happening. So it's not a perception, this is truth.
Yes,
Both.
I think it is both. There is certainly the perception. We have heard from many stakeholders that it is absolutely happening. The one, I think, area where we cannot provide an empirical backing is to say that advocacy that a participant has engaged in has led to an allocation committee member making a decision that they otherwise would not have made. That's not a claim that we are able to make, nor are we trying to make.
No, but the perception is that it's
there.
not a level playing field when people are submitting a proposal.
That's correct.
And, you know, there are other procurement processes that have been in place for a long, long time that account for that eventuality. Sure. Commissioner Vega-Peterson raises a great point. With a lot of these organizations, we have different interactions with them. But my understanding of city procurement policy is if there's an RFP, we're not to talk about it. We can meet with them and talk about the weather or something else, but not the actual RFP. So I think it's just an interesting point. Of all the things you've mentioned so far, it's the most interesting point to me.
And I'd like to add that there were scenarios that were provided, like, I guess you can say examples of like maybe meeting with the allocation committee or even any elected official to just share what their work has been doing, the target community that they've been serving. And we know that is totally open, even off cycle, the RFP cycle that is happening.
Very good, thank you.
I also want, Mayor Wheeler, you mentioned like it's the playing field isn't leveled, and I just want to point out that the playing field is never level, and so like I think what we hope to help increase the leveling of it, but we can mention lots of other places where the playing field is not level. In this
Yeah,
process,
and
right?
to be clear, I didn't say the playing field isn't level. The question was, is there a perception based on some degree of reality? And it sounds like the answer is yes. And given the nature of this particular funding source and given that it is supported by the taxpaying public, I want to make sure that as much as possible we eradicate that perception. It undercuts the legitimacy of the entire process, in my opinion.
We have some recommendations.
I know you do. I know you do. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first recommendation is this funding for small grants to support small emerging organizations. I won't go into depth about this because Alicia is going to follow up on this. Actually, I should back up a little bit. The full report has, I think there's 30 recommendations. The executive summary has our top 7. We felt it was really important to prioritize them and number them, in part because we make so many recommendations, but also because as the ones who did the evaluation, we understand the data and we understand how it resonates among how many people. So that's how we come to our prioritization of our recommendations. We are also thinking about equity and impact from an equity stance, so that's another consideration into our prioritization. So the first one is funding for small grants to support small emerging organizations, and we will go much more in depth in that in a few minutes. The second one is to reorganize Section 4 of the RFI, which is currently read as the culturally responsive section, and then to pull out from that section the bonus points and culturally specific bonus points and create another Section 5 that really talks about that more explicitly or more clearly, and also to raise bonus points from 3 points to 12 points as a demonstration of a real commitment to this work. And the third recommendation is reconsider the public testimony process. It sounds like, I mean, as Kevin pointed out, nobody likes that process. We think there are other ways to do this. The city of Beaverton, for example, has a 10-minute process where the organizations meet with allocation committee privately. They do 5 minutes of presentation and 5 minutes of Q&A. We understand that that's a different time impact, but we're just giving out ideas. The other thing is to maybe extend it to beyond 2 minutes even, particularly for agencies who are serving culturally specific or non-native English-speaking clients. That seems to be a challenge for them.
May I ask you a question on that? So I assume that is still a public process?
Which process?
When the applicant is meeting with the allocation committee in the city of Beaverton, I assume it is still a public meeting and therefore it's still a public process.
I believe it's still, I actually don't know the answer to that, and I'm not an attorney, but my understanding is as long as funding decision is not made in that room, then it doesn't, then that's okay. Yes, please do.
As a staff, as we discussed this particular finding with this team, we are interested in finding out from the city attorney's office where the line can be drawn with an individual applicant being able to talk to all of you either as a group or in smaller groups about their particular application in some kind of arranged format in advance of a decision-making process. But as it has stood historically, applicants come to a public meeting in which the full allocation committee makes decisions about funding after there is extensive public comment from any applicant who wishes to testify.
Thank you.
Mayor Wheeler, I can comment on the city of Beaverton's allocation process as someone that's actually gone through it.
Thank you.
So the way it works is that you actually, as the applicant, get an assigned time. You meet with the whole entire allocation committee. That is a public document, so each agency knows they get so much time. But the meeting is not a public meeting. It is only with the allocation committee, but there is no decisions made that time. But it's sort of like the public testimony process you would have here. Each agency gets 5 minutes, and then depending on how long the Q&A is. But the whole entire list is public record and the time that every agency gets. So,
very good. And the final decision then, Felicia, is made in public, I assume. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Our next recommendation is to reconceptualize the testimony advocacy process altogether. And what we mean by this is rather than making it this sort of this two-meeting period at the end of a grant-making process, right? To really reconceptualize it, to think of the entire 4 years as a testimony process, as opportunities to meet with the allocation committee. I mean, that's really where people are asking for more relationship building, right? So that they don't have to feel 2 minutes or 5 minutes is all the time they get to really sell their program to you. So to really sort of work on that, and it's one of the things that I think, one of the reasons why PCL staff recommendation feels so much more appropriate for a lot of grantees is because they've been building those relationships for years with the PCL staff, and they know their programs. And they would like to have that same opportunity with allocation committee members. Our next recommendation is opportunities for increased transparency. We have 3 in particular. We propose that you consider adopting a policy should allocation committee diverge from PCL staff recommendations. PCL staff have a process where if they diverge from, or if they don't recommend someone for funding, that they fill out. You might want to consider a process similar to that. Also consider adopting an appeals process. There are other levies in the country that have an appeals process. I think we give an example of Oakland's children's levy as having one. And we also recommend using the PCL website to this is another opportunity to level the playing field, which is sort of including FAQs on the website and other Q&As. Like, so people who have stronger relationships with staff might feel much more comfortable calling them up during the proposal process and asking a question. And if those questions and responses are put up on the website, that would provide opportunity for all applicants to receive the same information. Our next recommendation is considering the impacts of the recommendations on PCL staffing. We ask you to consider ways to increase capacity for staffing. The relationship building piece that we're asking for both the staff and for the allocation committee, that just takes a lot of time. There's also, 30 recommendations takes a lot of time, and we understand that the PCL is right now limited at a 5% administrative cap. So one of the recommendations is when it's up for reauthorization, consider upping the administrative cap. That feels really easy for me to say. I have no idea what that means, to like put in front of voters. But the other recommendation is reconsidering how PCL staff work is classified. So what is administrative work versus programmatic work, right? And I think there are other foundations that have looked at that and sort of tackled that issue. And our final recommendation, given that these are our priority recommendations, we ask that you consider convening a subcommittee to review these recommendations and implementation in a year's time.
I'd like to add 2 additional points to that. This subcommittee, we hope that you could create that subcommittee that could include community members and community participation. Let it be working with other entities in government to include, quote, community and neighborhoods and stakeholders.
So our first priority recommendation was about the small emerging organizations, and Leisha has done a lot of the research around that, and so she's going to talk more about that.
Thank you, Tuan. Good afternoon, allocation committee members, PCL staff members, and participants who are here today. My name is Leisha Shrestha, and I am a second-year doctoral student with PSU, with School of Social Work, and I'm also the part of research team. And before I start, I would like to bring your attention to what Kevin mentioned about high barrier to entry for some organization. So who are these organizations? Based on our interaction with participants and review of Oakland, San Francisco, Levy programs, and other foundations, what we have discovered is it is common for this smaller organization to face those kind of challenges, which is why these grant-making requirements are tailored to fit their needs, the needs of these organizations. These organizations have programs and services which are community-driven, they are trusted entity, and also they value the social and cultural capital of their community members. That's why they trust this organization. But there is a problem here, you know. They lack resources and support, technical support, to compete for larger grants. If they are provided with this foundational support, they have a huge potential for long-term outcomes that benefit the community, and the internal capacity building of smaller organization is key to remove such barrier. And I would like to quote a statement from one of the funders who said, "I think for funders, what is really about is looking over the next horizon. I sometimes ask who the next SEI is." So we need to find, search those organizations, build internal capacity within those organizations, and make them prepare to face, you know, the challenges, and also at the same time be ready to apply and compete for larger grants. This also highlights the concept that if smaller organizations are given the support they need, then there is a greater chance for organizations to get the funds, use the funds to serve the community with services they are looking for, connect with spaces they feel safe, and help them thrive in such environment. As we talked about how these small organizations have fewer resources of revenue than established organizations, I would like to share another quote which I believe resonates with a lot of smaller organizations. The quote begins, "It is almost impossible to generate the high level of data that PCL asked in the application itself." Because smaller organizations do not have staff capacity to compile data and create a report, the process can be expensive and time-consuming. If you talk about equity, then it is almost impossible for this smaller organization to compete with bigger organizations who have staff support and resources. So how we have come up with the recommendation is, it is important to develop small funds that is particularly dedicated to small organizations, small and emerging organizations that have never received PCL funds before, allowing them for a certain length of time, for example, 1 to 3 years, create lower budget caps, and allow higher indirect cost ceiling to build capacity and improve technical assistance for future readiness to apply for bigger grants. Thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to add that, I mean, that was an overwhelming finding from all of our, a lot of our interviews. Funded, people who were funded and people who were not funded, they really wanted to see this opportunity, because they, even the ones that were funded recognized sort of the privileges they had. I mean, they talked about, like, I have 4 people helping me write grants, right? Like, I don't know how someone else could do it. So I think that's one of our, that's one of the reasons it's our primary recommendation.
And so I have a question related to that. You said earlier that staff capacity for PCL staff was already stretched thin. How would that be possible with our current staff to create another grant program when they're stretched thin, being able to do the current process?
Lisa's chomping at the bit.
I don't know that it's fair to ask them that question. I think we would have to look at what kind of capacity we have, what kind of timetable we're trying to do it on, and I can't imagine we would not need additional help. So
yeah, that's what I was saying, because I was listening to their recommendations earlier about staff capacity, and I love the idea of having a smaller grants allocation process, but then I just heard you say staff capacity was a running theme as well.
And I'll comment that I think in our eyes, this recommendation goes hand in hand with the other priority recommendation around revisiting the 5% administrative cap and reconsidering the way the staff time is classified. So we see those two things going hand in hand and as sort of a long-term vision for PCL.
Okay.
Limitations of our study. So there are limitations. I mean, we did this, I'm really proud of the work we did in the time frame we did it in. We dealt with a lot of data, but we do have missing voices. Because of the time since the last process, we did not explicitly pursue talking to reviewers. Some of our applicants that we interviewed mentioned that they had served on a review panel, but their memories were a little bit fuzzy, so I think a further study might try to capture in a more timely way the reviewer experience. We interviewed far fewer unfunded applicants than we did funded applicants. The unfunded applicants were less interested in talking to us, as was part of it, I think. And then, you know, it was also like, we interviewed people in November and December. I mean, it's just a busy time for everyone. And we did no interviews of those who never applied. And I think this is particularly like where we would recommend some further study, because if you're going to consider a small emerging grant fund, that's probably the population you're wanting to look at. We also, in our study, we did a lot of looking into Oakland and San Francisco's levies, but there are other levies throughout the country that we did not look at. Seattle being one of them. I think Jacksonville, Florida has one. There are probably a couple other that aren't coming to mind, but those are other levies that you might want to think about doing some more data searches around. And finally, I want to thank everybody who participated in this process. People really generously gave of their time. Applicants, both funded and unfunded, they shared their stories with us. They made time for us during the holidays to talk to us. PCL staff were really fantastic, and we would come up with an idea, and we would sort of like tell them where we were going, and they would tell us the limits of the ordinance, and then we'd go back to our table. But I mean, just a lot of people gave of their time and energy to make this project happen, and we really want to thank them.
Thank you. And I want to just add that back in 2014 to now, the topic around equity has changed. I think the direction is a positive one, and we all certainly look forward to what comes next.
Very good. Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you
for doing this. So public testimony is next, is that correct? Who wants to testify? How many people want to come on up?
Thank you.
Don't come up at once. Don't all come up at once. All right, good. Nobody wants to testify. So Meg, that puts you right back.
Well, I just want to say again how thankful we as a staff are that the committee chose to invest in having an outside team come in and talk to our past applicants and to members of this committee and other stakeholders to gather this information. We as a staff in the past have certainly asked for feedback from different stakeholders in our process, but it's a lot different for us to ask than to have some folks who are not us be able to ask some of the hard questions and hear those hard answers. So I just want to say again how much I appreciate the PSU team who is just here. So thank you all. And thank you all very much, too, for your attention and to the presentation and your great questions. So we have a lot of work ahead. We obviously did this particular process in advance of knowing that you all need to set up a grant-making process for a new funding round coming hopefully sometime in the fall. And so in advance of that, over the next 5 months between March and June, we hope to talk with you and stage the various pieces of this process that you all will need to make some decisions on based on the information that you just heard. In the short term, we as a staff would like to meet with each of you individually to reflect on the report that you were just presented with and to help identify some of your priority areas for reworking our process. We also have some research and back work to do to help craft your decision-making going forward. For example, Felicia, what you just raised about the city of Beaverton is so helpful. That opens up wild possibilities for how this process could look different. So thank you for offering that. So we hope to meet with you individually before our March 18th meeting. We hope to take your individual sort of reflections and priorities and begin to use that to frame and stage the decision-making going forward around how our grant-making process will look. That timeline should allow you all to deliberate over some period of time. It will provide opportunities for public comment on the different pieces of the decision-making that you're going to need to do to get your grant-making process set up. And it'll give us time to kind of create iterations of things as people comment and as you all kind of decide you might want to shift directions. So that's kind of a time frame for where we're headed, so you don't have to make any decisions about anything with this today. I just also want to say with regard to the 30 recommendations that are in the report, while they did prioritize them, there are 7, and I wrote 8 in your memo, but there are 7 that we as staff see as relatively easy to implement without much discussion, and they mainly have to do with documenting our process and communicating that more clearly with applicants along the way. So some of those included creating an FAQ document for applicants and making sure that that's easily accessible, making sure that questions that applicants ask during the application process are posted with answers so that everybody can have access to that, developing written materials that describe our entire review process to applicants well in advance. So some things that we see as very easy as staff to accomplish. Obviously, there are several recommendations that are far more complex. They have, as you noted, implications for staff time. They have implications for your own time and commitments on this board. And they have other implications for the overall financial work of the levy. For example, creating a small grants fund and how you would approach that, how much money you would put into that, what the time frame for that would be. So we imagine that to be the work that we'll need to craft with you over the next several months. Questions on kind of the direction that staff hope to move with you on these recommendations?
Yeah, I had a question, and it was just related to one of the things that they weren't able to get at as much as as possible, which is about the role of the review committee and their experience with that process, especially considering, you know, the experience of the reviewers and their confidence in getting to know the organizations and making their recommendations, and then how that is weighed in on the process. I would love to get some more information on their experience if possible.
On the experience of the reviewers?
Yes.
Yes. We did do, I would be happy to provide, because we have it readily available, a survey with all of our past reviewers after their last process that was written. It was a written survey. It was anonymous in that they didn't have to write their name on it. There were some multiple choice or kind of fill-in-the-blank questions, multiple choice questions, I believe, and some fill-in-the-blank questions, and we did analyze those data, and we have some demographic information about them as well, so I can provide that. And there were certainly some really good ideas in their collective thinking about how to improve the process as well. But that might lead you to some other specific questions, which might help us improve more going forward. So I'm happy to share that.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes.
All right. We look forward to moving forward with you on this. You'll keep us posted.
And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Hansel, who's going to update you on our community engagement process.
Great.
So that is
Fabulous.
another big body of work that will help you in your decision-making going forward.
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah.
Hey, Lisa, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Welcome new members and returning members. This is on.
Is the light on?
It is on. Can you hear me?
Not really. Poke the button and see if that makes a difference.
Oh, that's better. Brighter green.
Much
That's
better.
better,
Thanks.
yes. So as Meg said, we have another process going on at the same time, which is the community engagement process. And information from this process will be used to inform the next round of funding, in that it will help to set priorities and strategies for the next round of investments. Just a little bit of background about this. Every 5 years, before we do move into a new levy period, the levy has undertaken community engagement work. In the past, levy staff have designed and implemented the community engagement process. And while we heard a lot of information, great information from service providers and stakeholder groups, the information that we received from community members at large was more limited. And we really know that in order to best address the needs of children and families, that we need to engage diverse families and parents and youth in the conversation and really hear from people that we haven't heard from in the past. We felt like the best way to accomplish this was to partner with a consultant team that has established relationships in the community with diverse populations in Portland. So last summer, we conducted an RFP process, and Empress Rules with Kiyoshi Owens as principal was chosen to be the consultant on this community engagement work and hired to design and implement the community engagement process. In October, the allocation committee reviewed the community engagement plan and approved the plan at that time, and a summary of the plan is in your folders, and the full plan's available on the Levy website. The goals of the community engagement process are to understand perspectives from diverse stakeholders about the most effective and most needed services for children, especially children affected by historical inequities. Also to identify community solutions to improve outcomes for children and families, to cultivate positive relationships with traditionally marginalized populations, and to promote community understanding of the Portland Children's Levy. In the community engagement plan, there were 3 engagement activities outlined. Those included outreach, using an interest questionnaire to identify representative sample of community members to survey. Also included surveys as an activity, and that is really to gather input on effective and most needed services for children. And then the third activity being focus groups to identify community solutions to improve outcomes for children and families. So I have a status update with each of those activities at this point. The first being the outreach and interest questionnaires. Those were distributed in November and December. Again, as the last team mentioned, difficult months really to ask people to do more of their time, but that's when the timing allowed. And during that time, the Empress Rules team and Levy communication staff really partnered together in getting the word out far and wide. Interest questionnaires were available in multiple languages, including English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Russian, Chinese, and Somali. By the end of December, 455 completed questionnaires were received. The goal had been 600. And of those 455, 66 were screened out, primarily because the respondents weren't from the city of Portland and really needed to hear from Portland residents. So there were 389 survey eligible participants, including 164 parents, 139 service providers, 78 youth, and 8 other interested community members. Levy staff reviewed so the interest questionnaire really included a lot of demographic kind of information. In that interest questionnaire, we weren't asked, they didn't ask questions about, what's your opinion about certain things. It was really to try to find a diverse group that could be sampled in the surveys. So it was really demographic information that was asked in there. And so Levy staff reviewed the demographics of the interest questionnaires and found that the following populations and groups were really well represented: African Americans, Native Americans, LGBTQ, people who've experienced homelessness, people who've experienced the foster care system, and they really were able to reach many more parents than Levy staff had done in the prior, back in 2013. Staff also identified some gaps in perspectives and groups that were underrepresented and populations underrepresented. And those included Latinx, Slavic, African immigrant, Middle Eastern, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, immigrants and refugees, and non-English speakers. So Levy staff requested that Empress Rules do additional outreach to the populations identified as being underrepresented in the questionnaire responses. So then moving into the surveys, all 389 of the eligible questionnaire respondents were invited to complete a survey. 2 surveys were developed, one for community, primarily parents and youth, and one for service providers. The community survey includes 25 multiple choice questions and is available in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Russian, and Somali. And the provider survey includes 4 multiple choice questions and 27 open-ended questions with providers invited to, they can skip areas if they're not their focus area, their area where they have a lot of opinion about. So in response to the Levy's request for additional outreach to the underrepresented groups, Empress Rules Teams has been conducting survey gatherings where they're going to community groups that represent the underrepresented groups that were identified and attending either group meetings or going to events, and they're bringing a combined questionnaire and survey for folks to fill out in person versus the other engagement was primarily done online. So they're building relationship, they're talking to people about the levy and asking, for their opinion and how, this is important information for you to share. This is a big investment in our community and in your children. So they've, at this point, conducted 7 of the gatherings as of January 27th and have received 67 completed interest questionnaire surveys through those efforts and have an additional 33 completed through other efforts. So in total at this point, there are 489 interest questionnaires completed and 220 surveys completed. They will continue, they originally had planned to have surveys completed at this point, actually by mid-January, but they are continuing to keep the survey open and will continue to do survey gatherings and accept surveys through the end of February or when they reach 500 surveys completed, whichever comes first. And then the third activity is the focus groups, and the goal was to have 8 focus groups, and all 8 of the focus groups have been completed as of this past Saturday. There were 2 youth groups, 2 Spanish-speaking parent groups, a foster care impacted group of parents and foster parents, a parents with children with disabilities and parents disability group, an immigrant refugee parent group, and 1 direct service provider group of service providers who also have children. And within each of these groups, as appropriate, Empress Rules was asked to select a balance of participants from historically marginalized communities. So, like I said, all 8 groups have been completed at this point with 84 participants. That included 51 youth, 51 parents, 22 youth, and 11 service providers. So after collecting and analyzing all of the data from these activities, Empress Rules will produce a community engagement report that includes the methods used to engage the community, which I just described, a summary of the findings and recommendations related to the programs and service needs and programming solutions for each of the levy's funding areas, and any other key findings that come up in either the surveys or the focus groups that they've done. And the community engagement report is scheduled to be presented to all of you by April 15th.
Great.
Do you have questions or comments?
Very thorough.
Okay.
Thanks, Lisa. Next, Meg is going to come back and tell us about the 2017-18 data report on PCL grants.
I wasn't kidding when I said you'd see a lot of me today.
All right. It's always entertaining. Interesting, entertaining, and
We'll
on
do our
point.
best.
Welcome back.
All right,
Yes.
thanks. So this is our once-a-year big report out to you all on the data that we collect from all of the programs that are funded through the Children's Levy. I just want to really quickly acknowledge how much work grantees do to make this information possible for us to put together for you all. We don't have internally a database that takes information on each child served that they put in, that has a child record and a bunch of information that might be interesting to us to aggregate and talk about with you. They complete their reports based on the information they keep within their organizations, and the reports that they create for us were, as you heard earlier, almost impossible to generate data for PCL requests. So I want to acknowledge how much work they do to create the types of reports and data that seem basic, but are actually much more difficult than we all realize to collect and put together. So,
Meg,
yeah,
it's a great point, and excuse me, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. And we heard and talked a lot about trying to come up with a small grants and a streamlined application process, but it doesn't solve the other two big juggernauts. One is what you just described, the reporting, but just the data and required, but it also, we have very strict outcomes that we require. So I guess the question is do we need to look at all three phases of how we do with that if we're going to go down the road of looking at a small grants program?
Yes, I think we do. I think we have to talk about a number of things, not the least of which is what our accountability expectations would be for those grants and how those would compare to the larger grants that we typically give, and what size of funding you want to give over what period of time. The typical grants that we give now, I think an average grant size is about $150,000 a year, and those grants are typically made for 3 years with the option to renew for 2 more years. So that's a much different, and the organizations that apply for those funds have much larger typical annual organizational revenue. So I think we have to take all those factors into consideration if we're going to pursue a small grants fund. So that'll be the work of staff to kind of think about how to parse those possibilities by looking at what other funders do with small grant funds and coming to you all with some of your, with feedback for your priorities too for that. Is there anything in particular, Mitch, you want us to keep our eye toward as we move forward on that?
No, it's just it's a much bigger challenge than just a small grants program.
Yes, it is. Yep. Okay, well, now that we've acknowledged that, I wanted to just say again, because many grantees are here, how much we appreciate the work that goes into their reports. We take their individual reports and we use predominantly Excel to aggregate up a lot of data that I will walk you all through today. This report covers our grant expectations, the results from those grants, and the implications for our larger levy-wide investment goals. And the data I'm going to talk about today are at a levy-wide level. We also put that information together at a program area level, so early childhood, child abuse prevention intervention, foster care, hunger relief, after school and mentoring, and that's in the 40-plus page report that you all got and that will be up on our website. So this is just the highlights. And just a reminder for everybody, the overall goals of the Children's Levy are to prepare children for school, to support their success inside and outside of school, and to reduce racial and ethnic disparities in children's well-being and school success. I'm going to primarily review, as we go forward, what we refer to as our main performance metrics. And so that's sort of which children, who was served, how many of them, and their demographics. How well did they participate in the services? Were their outcomes met? A little bit about what staff turnover looks like in our programs, and then sort of some broader implications. So that's our typical framework for looking at performance. I should have included a slide, but I oriented you, hopefully. And most of these data are looking at 17, 18 in an annual period. However, we do also, I'll start to also refer to the 4-year average of performance in this levy period. So for some things, we're looking just at last year, 17, 18, and for some things, we're kind of averaging performance over this 5-year levy period using the 4 years of data we've collected so far and comparing it to the previous 5 years. So in this levy period, in this 4-year levy period, at the beginning of this levy, the allocation committee at the time set a goal to invest at least 30% of the funds levy-wide in culturally specific services and 30% of funds in each program area in culturally specific services. And also set a goal to increase access to services for children and families who reside or attend school in East Portland. So just some contextual things to keep in mind. In 17-18, the levy invested $17 million in programs for children and families across the city of Portland. 33% of those funds were invested in culturally specific services. In the previous 5-year levy, the average was 31.4% of funds going to culturally specific services. So we increased it from the previous levy, and we met the goal at the levy-wide level last year. We also increased access to increased access to services for children in East Portland. In the previous levy period, an average of 38% of children lived in or attended school in East Portland, and last year 46.2% of children served lived or attended school in East Portland. So we increased that access in this levy period. In 2 program areas, we did not meet the goal of 30% of funds being invested in culturally specific services. One of those program areas was hunger relief. The largest grant in that area is with the Oregon Food Bank, which does our school food pantries, and so we invested in that system substantially, which isn't necessarily a culturally specific service. And the other program area was child abuse prevention and intervention. We had a culturally specific service in that program area that voluntarily chose to stop operating. And then we had another one where a grant to an agency that had 2 grants folded them into one and then no longer met the definition of being culturally specific, though is still operating a culturally responsive program. So we have some considerations there going forward into the next levy, into the next grant-making round. So these data I'm about to review are about the children who were served last year in 17-18. There were over 12,000 children served, and each grant has to set a goal for how many children or participants it will serve for the year, and grantees exceeded their goals by 9%. That exceeding goals is typical. Large-scale programs that have drop-in program models have a hard time predicting how many kids might come during a year, so they often end up serving a little bit more than they intend to or project to. And then programs have some amount of turnover as kids and families are mobile throughout our community, so they might not stay in the program throughout the whole year. So a program may end up serving more than they projected. The majority of children served were from families whose income is at 185% of the federal poverty level or less. So we look at that barometer because it's what qualifies a child or family for free and reduced price lunch program. Just contextual information, 185% of the federal poverty level for a family of 4 is $45,000 roughly a year. That's compared to Portland's median income last year of $74,000 for a family of 4. Let's see, 31% of the children served are from homes where the primary language spoken is a language other than English. Most of those children are Spanish speakers, are from homes with their Spanish speakers, but about 10% are from homes where the language spoken is one of 50 other languages, typically. 68.9% of the children served identify as children of color, and that's an increase from the previous levy where it was 64%. And as I said earlier, 46% lived or attended school in East Portland. 2.5% of children served last year were homeless, while the data that we have on parents and children served is 5.4%. One thing to note there is that in Portland area schools last year, about 3.7% of children were reported to be homeless by Oregon Department of Education data and definitions. So we may or may not be reaching homeless children as well as we should be considering their occurrence in our school-age population. And you all should feel free to ask questions as we go. I know, Mayor, you had a question about that earlier. What's the typical protocol? We can do it either way, but if it's easier, ask as we go. So the next thing we look at is trying to understand go ahead.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I thought you said 68% of the kids served identified as children of color. Mm-hmm. So you're including the Latino and Latinx in that group? Okay.
I am.
Thanks.
Thanks. This next table is a way that we try to look at how well did levy-funded programs reach the racial and ethnic diversity of our student population in Portland. So the grantees collect demographic, racial, and identity data from the families that they serve as they identify themselves, as families identify themselves, and they report that to us. So we look at, of the participants served, how they identify their race and ethnicity, and that's in that first column, levy-funded programs served in 17-18. So of the total participants, for example, 22% identified as Latinx Hispanic, And then the second column there shows students enrolled in Portland area schools last year. And when I say Portland area schools, I don't just mean Portland Public, I mean PPS, David Douglas, Park Rose, Centennial, and Reynolds primarily. So we're not looking at Gresham Barlow data in this area. So what we want to try to understand is how well does the population of children served by the Levy-funded programs look like the population of our students. And what we see is that we are serving a more racially diverse population than is served in our public schools. So we think that's a good thing because we're reaching kids who are historically underserved and facing more barriers to opportunity in our programs. When I say our programs, I should say our community's collective programs. One little area of note is that there has been a slight disparity in the populations served for Asian and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander. So there's a small percentage point difference between the population that enters Levy programs versus the school-wide population. So we probably have some work to do there. And in fact, our community engagement process is looking into how to, as you heard from Lisa, has identified those populations as places where we need to understand better how to increase access. So next we look at participation. It's one thing to know who walks in the door. It's another thing to understand whether or not they stick around and who they are. So we look at that two different ways. We look at who has left services quickly upon entry, so to speak, like within a month or 2 to 3 of entering a program, and then who sticks around long enough to meet participation goals that are associated with likelihood of meeting program outcomes. So what we know is that 7.6% of, on average, over the last 4 years, 7.6% of participants in Levy-funded programs left early, meaning they left after the first month to 3 of engaging in programs. That's down from the previous Levy period. And then an average of 79.3% of participants stuck around long enough to likely meet outcome goals. So that's good. That's about 80%. And that's up from the previous Levy period. So now that people are paying, we've asked programs to pay attention to this data point, and as they've paid more attention to it, they've also noted that they needed to increase retention strategies and outreach, and they've done a great job. And then the next thing, like in the previous table, what we want to understand is of the participants who enroll in our services and how they identify race and ethnicity, how well does that population match the population that stays in services over time? Because we want to understand, are there populations for which our programs are not engaging them well over time? And the good news is there is near parity between the racial and ethnic populations who enter Levy-funded services and those that stay and meet the participation goals of the program. So outcome goals. The Levies programs, depending on the program area, measure goals that are relevant to the program models that they offer. So we don't get in this presentation into a lot of information about what % of kids met this or that outcome because there's so many different outcomes across the different types of program models that we serve. So a way to shorthand that for you all is to look at the number of outcome goals that were met by programs. So collectively, grantees measure hundreds of outcomes, and we want to understand how well they met them. So of all the outcome goals that were measured by grantees, they met 81% of their goals. This is a decrease from the previous Levy period where they met 87.8% of their goals. A couple of factors have correlation with that. One is in this 4-year Levy period, there are a total of 32 programs that were funded new to this period that were not funded before. Those new programs take some time to get up and running, to figure out how to make sure their outreach strategies and engagement strategies work, to pick the right outcomes to measure and to set their goals accordingly. So for example, new grantees that were funded in the fiscal year 14-15 met 65.9% of their goals, and last year met 82.2% of their outcome goals. So you can see the increase over time for new grantees as they get used to doing more outcome tracking. Go ahead.
How many programs in this report were not in our 16-17 report?
Only 7,
so that's
I believe.
A pretty big drop for 7 programs. if that's the reason.
Previous
that the
levy
number was
period
pulled
is,
down.
maybe I'm confused.
Well, this is a 17-18 report, right?
Right.
So-
Previous levy period is 5 years, the previous 5-year levy, not last year.
Right, but we got this number last year in our annual report, didn't we?
Yeah, I don't think it was dramatically different from this, the
Okay.
average of 81, I'm misunderstanding. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Mitch.
no,
I'm
no.
sorry.
If it's not a big drop, I was just thinking we didn't fund very many new programs last year.
Correct.
So I wouldn't expect them to be able to make a 6 percentage point drop in our outcome report.
I think we're talking about two different things. When I say 87.8% in the previous levy period, I'm talking about the years 09 to 13.
Okay, so we're aggregating up to current year and looking back.
Yes,
Okay,
in that
okay.
09
That's
to
my mistake.
13 5-year period, it was 87.8. For this 14 to 18, 4 years, it's 81.2.
Which is why the new programming is relevant, because in that first period, there was 32 different programs
Yeah,
that were
yeah,
added.
I know we had a big number to
Okay,
start.
that's
Yeah.
where I think the.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thanks
It's
for
hard to
clarifying.
understand.
One other little sort of way of thinking about what impacts these differences is, for example, in early childhood, which is a program area I'm highly familiar with because I monitor those grants. A grantee might set a goal that 90% of the kids that they serve will be on track with typical developmental milestones for the ages of the children that they serve, or 90% will be on track with immunizations. When they report their data at the end of the year to me, they may be at 88% of kids for both of those. Well, they've missed those goals by the way that we count them. So just in thinking about this metric, it's a little sensitive to what we decide to do with it, so. The next one, staff turnover. So one of the reasons we look at this is because it matters what the relationship between the staff and the programs that the levy funds and the children and families that they serve, and most of the programming that gets funded by the levy is intensive, longer-term programming. Not all, but much of it is. So on average, over this levy period, so the 4 years of this 5-year period, 21% of staff supported through levy-funded programs turned over. The range is typically 15 to 20%, and that varies across our different program areas. One thing to keep in mind when we look at these data is that we don't track the reasons that staff turn over, so I can't tell you if they turn over because they were promoted or they retired or they decided to go back to school and pursue a higher level of education. We don't have the ability to track that level of detail. We just know that what the turnover looks like. One thing that we did dig into a little bit more this year for sake of context is how our trends compare to the sectors that we fund. So I can tell you, for example, that in child welfare, the child welfare sector generally, 30% of people working in jobs in that sector turn over. In Oregon specifically for early childhood over the last several years, 16 to 29% of that workforce turns over. And in after-school or youth development programs, but primarily after-school programs, national literature said 25% of full-time employees and 40% of part-time employees turn over after 1 year of working in those programs. So in that way, the turnover that's occurring in levy-funded programs is pretty typical of its sector.
I had a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I've been hogging it, so please.
I just had a question about this percentage. Did you get the granularity to see if any of the difference in percentages maybe between some of those ongoing programs and the newer programs, if there was a higher percentage in some versus the other?
I did not do that analysis for this report, but we could do it.
Yeah, I would just be curious to see
Yeah.
if the new organizations had higher rates of turnover, if that was part of the growing pains
Yep.
of becoming a new organization.
Keep in mind that just because we funded them doesn't mean the organization is new. They might be new to our funding, but they may not be a new organization. They could have been around for a long time. So I just want to make
That clarification.
Yeah, and to further add complexity, the organization may be a long-time receiver of levy funding for different programs, but they had a new program that started that they weren't operating before. So, but either way, just for how we define new programs compared to ongoing programs, we can certainly look at that if you're.
Okay.
Always more complicated.
Sorry.
This has been an area of concern for a while for us, and we have looked for ways to invest in to try to help our grantees address this. So have we been able to take a look at that? I know it's new.
We did look at it, so I have a little bit of data there. So what Mitch is referring to, for those of you who are new to the board, a couple of years ago, the Levy invested in extensive reflective supervision training and workplace trauma-informed wellness training for staff working in early childhood funded programs, child abuse prevention, intervention, and foster care, because those are the areas that we were seeing the highest turnover, and those are the areas where the stress of families has the greatest impact oftentimes on the experience of the staff working with families. So last year, in 16-17, I think I've used last year interchangeably to mean a lot of things. Apologies. So in 16-17, the child abuse prevention, which was a year and a half after the Levy had made that kind of investment to support those staff, the child abuse prevention intervention program area saw its all-time lowest turnover rate, which was exceptional, and we were thrilled, and it was only 14.7%. Unfortunately, that went back up this past year. It's over 30%, which has been a place it's gone over time. However, foster care was 10 percentage points down in 17-18 compared to 16-17. And early childhood was 6 percentage points down last year compared to the previous year. So these areas fluctuate. It's hard to know. I can tell you from the data that we have collected from the programs participating in those investments that they truly value them. They feel like it's making a difference in general on the climate of their workplace and the support that staff feel. And in particular, right now, with the national climate being political climate being what it is, both the staff are experiencing what the families that they serve are experiencing, and they are feeling more able to manage those feelings that they themselves are experiencing as they serve staff. So how that shows up in turnover rates, I think, is too hard for us to control for with the type of data that we collect as it is. And it's not the only thing that affects turnover. We still don't pay great in these sectors, and what we can provide as benefits to folks varies by agency. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that turnover is a loaded dynamic, and we're doing our best, but we feel good about the investments that we have made so far in those 3 program areas to support the climate and the workplace wellness of the staff who are doing some of our hardest field work, so to speak. And I'm sorry, we're not done. In Hungary, so the programs, all the data I just covered, I know, thanks Lisa. All the data I just covered are for the program areas of early childhood, child abuse prevention, intervention, foster care, after school, and mentoring. Those programs make referrals of children and families to the hunger relief programs that the Levy funds. Because of that, we can't say that those 12 kids plus the 14,000 kids served in hunger relief and their families we can't add them together. So we talk about hunger relief a little bit separately because we don't have child level data to say who all is getting what. So hunger relief, there were over 14,000 children and 4,000 parents and caregivers served. School pantries comprise the largest part of the investment in that area. They served 64% of the total kids. And then there are other emergency food resources that comprise that service population, 36% of the total served. Nearly 60% of the children served in hunger relief programs reside or attend school in East Portland. The program served, compared to school enrollments, the program served a higher portion or higher percentage of Latino and Asian children in its programming, but we're kind of underserving the African American population in our hunger relief services. So that is one area of focus in the community engagement work, is trying to understand what is and influencing that, and what should we be considering going forward with hunger relief investments. But we should also just be careful about any of the conclusions we draw with those demographic data in this program area, because we're missing that data on about 1/3 of the children served.
That's a lot.
Which went up substantially this year, which I think is climate-related potentially.
A couple of highlights in that area. There were grantees who provided emergency food resources at schools that didn't have pantries this year, so through backpacks and other food distribution opportunities. The percentage of families who were using a pantry 6 or more times during the year has grown and is now at 49%. I think that is a stark statistic. There continues to be strong demand for the delivered meals program that Meals on Wheels operates through Levy funding for families with barriers to accessing emergency food, and those barriers are primarily chronic illness of the caregiver or the child, or tremendous transportation barriers to access emergency food. And there continues to be strong demand for the food discounts at the Village New Market community, Village New Market at the New Columbia community. Over 700 families were enrolled in that program, and the program continues to focus its outreach on non-English speaking families. And then this wraps up our last highlight slide of operations. So the Community Child Care Initiative is something that the Levy first funded in 2006 when the mayor was an esteemed member of our board at that time. It had 5 years of funding. It had to ramp down because of the economic recession and the decline of levy revenues. And then a couple of years ago, when levy revenues picked back up, we were able to restart that program. That program is designed to help families pay no more than 10% of their income on childcare, particularly low-income working families. It serves families who receive the state employment-related daycare subsidy, so their income is at 185% of the federal poverty level or less. It also serves children from families up to 200% of the federal poverty level. So one of the things we heard when we were creating this initiative was that families who graduate off of the state subsidy often find themselves having to make ridiculous choices in order to keep their kids in safe childcare. And so our attempt was to kind of help mitigate some of that and keep those folks having some safety net as they transition into their jobs over time and hopefully build their income to be able to sustain themselves more easily. So there were 332 children served through the Community Child Care Initiative last year. And I'm talking about, I should have mentioned, I'm talking about this separately from all other program areas because it serves children not just in early childhood, but through school age as well. So it's not a program area specific investment per se. Before I talk a little bit about the children served, I wanted to give you some other context. The benefit that was provided by the levy, monthly median benefit per family was $338, but those families had an income of only $2,200 monthly median income. Their child care costs, monthly median child care costs were $1,000, and they were receiving state subsidy, a monthly median amount of state subsidy at $583. So you can see how the levy-funded initiative is building off of what the state is able to contribute to. In addition, the providers who serve these families are expected to participate in the state's quality rating system, and so I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But of those 332 children, 41% identified as a child of color, 33% were white, but we were missing information on 26% of the children served, so there's caution again on how we interpret those data. 58% of the children spoke English as a primary language, 20% spoke Spanish, and 6% spoke one of the other languages. About a third of the children served were infants and toddlers, 41% were preschool-age children, and 29% were over the age of 6. About 45% of the children served reside in East Portland, and about 52% of the providers who participated in serving children are located in East Portland. There were 58 providers who participated in this effort last year, and so as I noted, they have to be licensed. They have to be actively participating in the state's quality improvement framework. Just a side note about that, that's under major revision right now, so these providers are kind of doing their best with a shifting ground, but they've been committed to it. Within that framework, there's a star rating system, so as providers demonstrate quality along the standards that the state has set at graduating levels, they earn stars for that. So 16 out of those 58 providers were star rated, and 98 or 29% of the children in care through the initiative were in care with those star rated providers. So we are helping low-income families access some of our higher quality child care. And last slide, as I already alluded to, a lot of these data have helped us identify areas for greater focus and kind of understanding for where to increase service access with our community engagement process, kind of further questions to delve into how to improve service access. And then in general, they have they illustrate that the levy is reaching the population that it is intended to serve. So
Thank you.
happy about that. And kids are staying in services and their outcomes being met as well. Any questions?
Excellent, thank you. We
Well,
are
still
now
awake, I can see that
not
in minor
short
triumph.
on data. Oh, that's disappointing, after all that.
It was bound to happen.
You made it through the entire
know, right?
presentation, too. And that's why we don't have nice
I
things.
have ample paper to soak it up.
Very good. So, looks like Meg is coming back. Is that right?
Am I?
No.
No.
Lisa?
Back.
No?
I'm cleaning up my mess.
I'll give Meg a break and let her clean up her spill. Just a couple of brief words about what to expect for the next meeting. We are meeting
off the hook.
again in March. You doing okay there?
I am.
Okay.
We've never actually had anybody drown at the staff table. This may be a
This
first,
might be a first. I don't know. There you go.
totally
I was gonna say.
figuratively. Or literally.
I felt like I was drowning at times. Does that count? Drowning in data, perhaps? I want to give everybody just a heads up about what's coming, and also for folks paying attention in the community as well, and we're kind of putting word out to make sure everyone understands. So at the next meeting, at the March meeting, one of the big pieces of business is we'll be looking at renewals of existing grants. One thing to back up again, I know we've got a lot of new folks here. This quote-unquote funding process, so all of the work we're doing around process improvement and community engagement, and then the actual funding process part is taking 2 years this time. We used to do all of that in 1 year, and so we are essentially have put off making a new competitive set of awards, and are going to consider the existing grantees for a renewal. And all of that information is going to come to you next time. You can expect a bunch of the usual, for those who have been with us, the usual round of data will be coming your way shortly. And for the new folks, we'll take you through that in individual meetings so you understand what's going on with that.
So, sorry,
go ahead.
how long is that renewal process for then? The one that we're going to be doing next month?
How long is the renewal process is
The grant renewal.
Yeah, it's pretty, so what we do is we'll give you all, that's kind of all this data that you just listened to, a lot of that data basically gets fed back to the grantees in a grant performance summary, so they can understand how they performed on their grant, how they performed over time, and how it compares to how others in their program area performed.
So this is just the information that we're going to be getting?
You're going to
next
get a
month?
bunch of information.
Okay.
You'll get staff recommendations and rationale, so we'll tell you what we're recommending and why. You'll have a chance to ask us questions. The grantees have a chance to see their grant performance summaries. Staff writes their comments and their recommendations on those summaries. The grantees have a chance to write their comments if they wish to, if they have any. And then all of that paperwork goes to you all. And so you get the individual paperwork and you'll get it amalgamated into a much more high-level summary of all of that. Then we make the decisions at the meeting. Those are, usually fairly swift. You don't have presentations, and you might have, if you have questions, we ask grantees to be present in case you would have any questions. So that's the basic process for it. There's not a lot to it, and other than that, and if you have requests for more information along the way, you'll have time to ask us for that. And if you want anything additional, we can find that for you before you have to make a decision. Okay, you were looking up like you had a question. So that's what's going to happen at the March meeting for a part of the time. And then what we'll try to do, we're going to, as Meg mentioned, we're going to try and meet with you all as well around all the recommendations from PSU that you heard, and try to understand what your priorities are, and then come to you at the March meeting with a beginning of that conversation. So we'll kind of take a look at what the priorities, and also some of this would have to be staged. Some decisions you'd have to make first in order to make other decisions later. So we've already figured out a few of those things, and we'll kind of be focusing on that. Like, for instance, small grants fund, if you wanted to do that, you likely would need to take that money off the top of the funding. So that is a decision that would behoove you to make sooner rather than later, so then you can understand what resources you want to put into which pools, because you will have to divide the resources by funding area in preparation for launching the competitive round. So that's one additional heads up that you'll have, that we're going to try to stage these things so that you can make the decisions in an order that makes sense. So that's what's coming up. Any other questions?
So is the meeting going to be at 3 to 5 on the 18th, or 2:30 to 4:30?
3 to 5.
Okay.
And we'll send out reminders. Hopefully no inclement weather. Right before spring break, for those of you on school calendars.
Shouldn't be. Okay.
It'll be before. It'll be your send-off.
All right, so we're on next from 3 to 5 p.m. Monday, March 18th. Agendas will be sent to the Levy database and posted on the website. And we're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram. You can go to the website. There's lots of great ways to stay in touch. Until then, farewell. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.